Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 349 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about bullet failures. Now, bullet failures are a hot topic, especially when they involve certain very polarizing bullets and or cartridges. The same is also true for those advocating using a, let's just say, non-traditional cartridge or bullet for a certain task. Now, I absolutely believe bullet failures do occur, but I think they get blamed unfairly for a lot of wounded and lost game. I can't tell you how many people I have had tell me that they made a perfect shot on an animal, but the bullet, quote unquote, blew up on the shoulder, the animal ran off, and they never saw it again. I'm not saying that never happens, but unless you recover the animal afterwards, you're just guessing about why the animal ran off, and blaming the bullet is a convenient excuse that is easy to throw out there. But like I said, though, bullet failures absolutely do occur, and wild things do occasionally happen afield. To that end, I have compiled a giant list of those sorts of stories, and I will share them all with you in this episode. Before we get started, I have a couple of announcements to share with you. So first, I will be at the Dallas Safari Club Convention in Atlanta, 9 to 12 January 2025, with two of my African professional hunters, Johan and Kobus. We would love to meet you if you will be attending the show. We are hosting a get-together for podcast listeners and past/future clients at a conference room in the Hyatt House Atlanta downtown, 6 to 10 p.m. on Friday, 10 January 2025. Address is 431 Marietta Street Northwest, Atlanta, Georgia. Pizza and beverages, alcoholic and non-alcoholic, will be provided. Space is limited, so please RSVP by emailing me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, if you plan on attending. Next, if you want to hunt Africa, we are almost full for 2025, but I currently have 4 spots remaining for hunts in September, October, and early November 2025, all right at the end of the dry season. We also literally just started booking for 2026, so have lots of availability for that year right now. Visit bestsafarihunt.com for more details if you think 2025 or 2026 will be the year you want to book your dream hunt in Africa. Finally, this is the last announcement before we dive into bullet failures. I am giving away 2 boxes of Federal Fusion 308 Winchester ammo. Anyone who is a citizen or legal permanent resident of the USA, over the age of 21, who is not otherwise prohibited from possessing a firearm, and who resides in a state I can ship to, is eligible to enter. Sign up at the link in the show notes at thebiggamehuntingblog.com/ammo giveaway, and you will be entered in a random drawing for those 2 boxes. One person will get both boxes. Be sure to confirm your email address if you are asked to do so after you sign up. You have until 11:59 p.m. Central Time on 18 December to sign up. That's next week. I will randomly select one lucky listener from all the submissions on 19 December to receive this ammo. Okay, now let's get started talking about bullet failures. So what the heck is a bullet failure? In the context of this episode, when I talk about a bullet failure, I'm not referring to a situation where someone recovered a bullet out of an animal they cleanly killed and it simply did not look like they expected it to. Nor am I referring to a situation where a hunter merely found the bullet core and jacket separated on the offside hide of a dead animal. No, in this episode, I'm going to discuss actual verifiable instances where the hunter made a good shot on an animal that should have killed it, but that did not occur. Most of these stories involve a bullet that delivered unexpected and sometimes wildly unexpected performance, usually either due to failing to penetrate deep enough to reach the vitals or by failing to expand or upset in a manner appropriate to cause sufficient damage to the vitals of the animal for a rapid kill. However, a few of the stories I'm going to share with you do involve people using inappropriate cartridges and or bullets for the job at hand and having things not work out. And usually that's because the bullet fails to penetrate deep enough to reach the vitals of the animals. Some of these stories also involve hunters using specific bullets outside the parameters recommended by the manufacturer and thus having the bullet fail to perform as desired, though in hindsight the results they obtained shouldn't necessarily have been unexpected to someone knowledgeable about terminal ballistics. So I will still include stories of instances where the bullet technically performed as designed, but were just used improperly by the hunter as a cautionary tale of how things can go wrong. It is also important to note that while some bullets are more likely to fail under certain conditions than others, none are invulnerable. These are devices made by people, and thus they are imperfect and will have issues sometimes. Beware of small sample size bias, too. If you shoot thousands and thousands of head of game with a particular bullet, it is not unreasonable to expect that a few will fail for whatever reason, be that a manufacturing defect or some other reason we may never be able to figure out, and not necessarily a problem with the bullet design itself. And the fact that I have a couple of stories about a certain bullet type not performing well afield doesn't necessarily mean that bullet is going to perform like that every single time. Of all the stories I'm about to share about so-called bullet failures, I experienced one myself indirectly. You'll hear here in a second, but it's an animal I killed that somebody else had shot previously. A couple of other stories are from my dad. The rest are listener-submitted stories. I can only verify one of these stories with my own eyes. That said, each instance of a bullet failure I'm going to share with you does involve a recovered animal where the hunter was able to examine exactly what happened afterwards. So none of these stories involve an animal that ran away and was never recovered, but the hunter just blamed it on a bullet failure when they weren't really sure what happened. I have screened those stories, and I will only share tales that seem credible, but that is still assuming the listeners who submitted these stories are telling the truth and are remembering things correctly. Some of these are more recent incidents. Some listeners submitted photo evidence. Others are from incidents from a long time ago and do not have any accompanying evidence. So take all of that for what you will. Like I said, I'm sharing the stories I found most credible. I did notice some interesting trends with these stories too, and I have arranged everything in this episode to highlight those trends, and I will cover it again at the end of the episode. So after that lengthy introduction and all of those caveats, let's get started talking about bullet failures. So the first story involves a Cape buffalo I shot back in 2012. Long story short, I shot this buffalo in the left shoulder at about 120 yards. He was close to broadside when I shot him, armed with a rifle chambered in 9.3 by 62 millimeter Mauser. First bullet that I shot him with, the one that was in the chamber initially, 286 grain Swift A-frame. The remaining bullets in my magazine were 286 grain Woodley full metal jacket bullets. So I shot this buffalo in the shoulder. It was a good shot. He turned, ran a few steps, then stopped and stood unsteadily with his rear facing me. I shot again, this one with a full metal jacket, hit the buffalo in the pelvis close to where the spine connected to the pelvis. He went straight down at that point. He was lying on his left side with his right side facing up when we walked up to the buffalo a few minutes later. Interestingly, we found 2 wounds on the right shoulder of this buffalo, though. That was really weird considering I shot it in the left shoulder and in the rear end. I recovered all of my bullets from that buffalo, none exited. So we were thinking, what the heck is going on here? Where'd these other 2 bullet holes come from? A closer examination of the buffalo when we were butchering it revealed that he was shot twice with an AK-47 on the right shoulder sometime previously, maybe a couple of days before my hunt. The shot placement on those 2 shots from the AK was pretty good, but neither penetrated into the body cavity. There was basically just 2 probably painful flesh wounds on the shoulder, though they were both healing. They weren't completely healed at this point, but they were heading in that direction. They were both still bleeding just a tiny bit. There was just a couple of drops of blood coming out of each of them. Now, we did not actually see somebody else shoot this buffalo with an AK-47, but based upon the bullets that we pulled out of this buffalo's shoulder and how they performed, we made a strong inference that they were 7.62 by 39 millimeter full metal jacket bullets from an AK-47. They looked a whole lot like a 123 grain FMJ bullet. Now, like I said, we found those bullets inside the shoulder. They did not penetrate into the body cavity. As we removed that front shoulder off of it, it was clearly seriously injured, but we recovered both of the bullets inside the shoulder itself. There was no damage whatsoever to the rib cage of the buffalo on that side. Based upon the location that we killed this buffalo in and what we could tell about the bullets, like I said, probably from an AK, probably a poacher shot this buffalo. We were hunting in Zimbabwe, close to the border with both South Africa and Mozambique, and we were not very far from either country. The buffalo was possibly shot in Zimbabwe before I killed the buffalo, but it's also possible that it was shot in one of those other two countries just over the border. There were several instances over the course of our 10-day hunt where we would go down to the river in the morning, see fresh tracks of where buffalo had crossed the river at night, and then follow that group of buffalo and try and get on them. This buffalo I killed was from a bachelor group of bulls, and as far as I can remember, we found their tracks by happenstance while we were tracking a herd of other buffalo. So they had been there for at least a full day before we got there. They hadn't crossed over that evening, but they were close enough to the river, and like I said, the other buffalo were behaving in that way that it's very easy for me to imagine that they were in Mozambique or South Africa, say the week prior, something happened to them, then they moved over into Zimbabwe. But they could have been there the whole time, and like I said, someone shot them there, trying to kill one of them too. Shot placement on those bullets was excellent. Either one of them, if it had been, say, from a 375 or whatever, with an appropriate bullet, would have been a fatal shot to that buffalo. Almost textbook shot placement in both cases where you want to shoot a broadside buffalo. But neither one of those bullets penetrated into the body cavity. This is really just a demonstration of how darn big and tough Cape buffalo are. That buffalo gave no indication that he was injured when I shot him. And I wonder if it was one of those M67 Yugoslav bullets for the 7.62 by 39 I referenced in episode 347 that will readily tumble upon impact, but doesn't penetrate very well. So this is a good example of what can happen when using a bullet and cartridge inappropriate for the game you are pursuing. My professional hunter kept those two bullets probably because of his suspicion that a poacher was involved in this incident, but I don't know what all became of it after I left. I really wish I would have made more of an effort to keep those bullets myself, though. Regardless, that was certainly unexpected performance for those bullets for me at the time, and it definitely gave me an appreciation for the size and toughness of a Cape buffalo. But this is an example of someone just using a terrible tool for the task at hand. So next story involves my dad. This is also from a hunt in Africa. He went to Africa on his first safari back in 2005, so almost 20 years ago as I record this. He loves old classic firearms, old classic single shots and lever action rifles in particular. On this hunt, he brought a Browning 1885 single shot rifle in 5110 Winchester. That was originally a really big black powder cartridge. He made some hand loads for it with smokeless powder that more or less duplicated the original ballistics of that round. So on this hunt, he was using 450 grain Barnes bullets in this rifle. But this was one of the older lead core Barnes bullets. This was not a copper Barnes bullet. Long story short, he shot a Gemsbach with this rifle, crippled it, then shot it a second time at closer range in the neck to finish it. That shot killed the Gemsbach instantly, broke the Gemsbach's neck, but kind of shockingly, the bullet did not exit that Gemsbach neck. So like I said, 450 grain Barnes bullet, muzzle velocity of around 1,800 feet per second, so going a little bit slower than that. But even so, he was still pretty surprised that bullet did not exit the animal's neck. Gemsbok are big animals and they're tough animals, but they're not gigantic animals. A buffalo is way bigger than a Gemsbok. As they butchered this animal, they recovered the bullet from inside that neck, and it was expanded to a gigantic size. Now, it was already pretty big going in at 50 caliber, and it expanded to a massive size. He said it was bigger than a silver dollar when he recovered it. Well in excess of 90% weight retention, just massive expansion. So it worked. It killed the animal cleanly, all of that stuff. But this is a good example of how having massive expansion like that, even combined with great weight retention, can result in less than expected penetration, right? Guys often want lots of weight retention. Like, oh, no, I don't want a bullet with 60% weight retention. I want it with 80 or 90 or whatever, because they think that is good for penetration. Well, this is an example of a bullet that had lots and lots of weight retention, just not very good penetration, because it was combined with that ridiculous amount of expansion like that. So even though it killed the animal, it certainly behaved in a manner that my dad did not expect at the time. Now, next story also involves my dad, actually from the same hunt, also involving a Gemsbok, a different Gemsbok in this case, but he had the opposite problem here. Now, like I said, he brought these lever action rifles to Africa with iron sights, and they work fine at shorter range, but he hunted part of this trip in Namibia in the more open regions of that country, in the Kalahari, where the country was just more open, and he was presented with some longer range shots. Well, in this case, he got a shot on a really nice Gemsbok. It was too far for him to shoot with his 5110, so he used the guide's 7mm Remington Magnum that had a scope on it. And it was one of these situations where the guide was like, here, shoot my rifle. My dad determined later that the rifle was loaded with 140 grain Winchester ballistic silver tip bullets. All right, so I'll tell you what happened, then we'll talk more about these bullets. Anyway, he got this shot at a Gemsbok that was quartering towards him slightly, at about 200 yards, something like that. It was far enough where he couldn't shoot it with his 5110, but not extremely far. Anyway, he shot this Gemsbok square on the point of the shoulder. The Gemsbok went down, but was clearly not dead, and it was struggling and trying to get up. They ran up to the Gemsbok while it was on the ground struggling, and my dad took his old rifle back and shot it at much closer range behind the shoulder and killed it. Well, when they butchered this animal, they saw that initial shot broke the Gemsbok's front shoulder blade very low, just above the quote-unquote knuckle in that shoulder blade, where it's really thick, but failed to penetrate into the body cavity of the Gemsbok. So the Gemsbok fell down, had a very serious flesh wound, but that was not an immediately fatal wound. That Gemsbok could have lived a long time with a wound like that before finally succumbing to infection or predators days, weeks, months later. Fortunately, my dad shot the animal again and killed it. Now, Winchester has used two different general bullet designs over the years they have called the ballistic silver tip. One was the old aluminum capped bullet, and they currently use a Nosler ballistic tip. They used to use the Nosler ballistic tip with the black coating. Now they don't even do that. It's literally a Nosler ballistic tip bullet with no other changes right now. So if you go to the store and buy Winchester ballistic silver tip ammo, that's what you're going to get. Now, like I said, this story took place in 2005 in Africa. I'm not exactly certain what specific version of the ballistic silver tip was used on this hunt. I asked Ben Frank from Winchester about this. He said he has worked at Winchester for 22 years, and they had stopped using the old ballistic silver tips before he got there. He said they made that switch at least 30 years ago. So that would put the switch in the early to mid 1990s. Now, you never know what you're going to encounter in a hunting camp in Africa. Ammo availability can be pretty tricky in some parts of Africa, especially in some of the more isolated hunting camps. So it's certainly possible that they had some very, very old ammo on that hunt. So it is possible, maybe even likely, my dad shot that Gemsbok with the old aluminum capped ballistic silver tip. It's really hard to find info on those old bullets. Winchester made them for a really long time, and I have heard they changed their recipe several times over the years. I have heard some hunters describe the ballistic silvertip as a tough, controlled expansion bullet. I've heard others describe the ballistic silvertip as very soft. I think those were both accurate descriptions of various different iterations of the ballistic silvertip in different bullet weights and in different bore diameters at various times in its existence. The gun writer John Barsness has shared a few stories about the ballistic silvertip on the 24-hour Campfire forum. Here's one of them. Quote, I had a 150 grain silvertip from a 30-06 factory load come apart and fail to penetrate beyond the shoulder of a four-corn mule deer at 200 yards. Found what was left of the flattened jacket against the ribs on the same side after I tracked him down and put another through the ribs, which exited. This was the mid-1980s. Could give a couple of other examples of both good and bad performance from the original silvertips. The reason I gave up on them, some batches worked well, others didn't. It was hard to figure out what would be the result. As noted in my earlier posts, I suspect jacket thickness varied some over the years. I have a friend with a small box full of 130 grain silvertips from dead elk he and his dad have killed over the years with various 270 Winchesters, all perfectly mushroomed with jacket and core intact. His father bought 1,000 of them when my friend was in high school. He's in his 50s now. Apparently, that batch was very good. On the other hand, my late friend Walter White, stepping outside of his post here, I'm sure this is a different Walter White from the one in the Breaking Bad television show. Continuing, my late friend Walter White killed a brown bear on Kodiak Island in 1954. That's one of the few listed in Boone and Crockett with a skull measuring over 30 inches. He used a pre-64 375 H&H with factory 300 grain silvertips. The bear was wet from crossing the Zaker River, and Walter was shooting across the river. He didn't know exactly how many shots he fired, but did remember reloading the rifle's magazine twice. The bear would snarl and bite where the bullets hit, and sometimes even fall, but kept getting up again. When he and his guide skinned it, they found most of the bullets had broken up on the wet hair, with most barely getting through the skin. He swore off silvertips forever. End of quote. Remember, that was a 375 H&H he was using on that bear, and it sounds similar to John Nosler and his moose from many years ago, though Nosler was not using ballistic silvertip bullets, as far as I know, and he was using a 300 H&H instead of a 375 H&H. Now, I think John's explanation makes sense. For instance, those 130 grain 270 cal ballistic silvertips from the 1970s sounded like they worked great, and I can understand why those who had good experiences like that really loved those bullets. But at the same time, it sounds like those 150 grain 30 cal ballistic silvertips from the 1980s don't sound like they worked very well. And it's possible my dad was shooting a 7mm version of that bullet that performed in a similar manner. For what it's worth, my grandfather loved the 150 grain ballistic silvertip in his 30-06. And he would positively gush about how well that bullet performed on whitetail deer. I think he got a pile of those bullets in the 1960s or 1970s, though, so I would not be surprised if they were a different recipe than from what John described using in the 1980s. Maybe a different jacket thickness, maybe slightly different alloy in the jacket or core. A small change like that could make a giant difference in terminal performance. Now, like I mentioned, Winchester did eventually change over to the Nosler ballistic tip, so don't worry about running into a problem with any of those old ballistic silvertips. They're completely different from what you'll get buying factory new silvertip ammo at the store today. There are still some of the old ones out there in people's personal collections, but that's about it. Now, as you will see, though, problems with older bullets is a theme we will encounter more than once in this episode. Here is another example along those lines I received from a man named George in Colorado. I quote, "Back from 1998 to 2011, I hunted with a bunch of guys that mostly shot 300 Win Mags. I reload, they didn't. They financed a supply for 500 rounds of 180 grain Remington core locks. They loved them. I quit hunting in 2011 due to health, but I knew of over 50 elk killed with all of these loads between this group of hunters. Ranges varied from 30 feet in timber to about 400 yards across the wide open. They worked perfectly except for one instance. In 2000, I saw a herd of about 200 plus elk. 7 of them split off. They were about 200 yards up a steep hill in knee-deep snow, close to 30-degree weather. I laid over a rock and shot a cow from that group. I hit her perfectly right behind the shoulder, just below halfway up. It knocked her down. She slid nearly 100 yards downhill towards me. I thought, wow, what a shot. I started up there knowing she wouldn't slide all the way down. Amazingly, when the slide stopped, she got up and took off running. I made a bad offhand shot to the top of her hips and spine. That put her down with legs uphill. When I got about 10 feet from her, I slipped on a rock, looked down, heard a noise, and looked up to see her head up and pawing hard trying to get me. I shot her in the head and finished her off at about 10 yards. I tugged an ear on the elk and she slid all the way down to hit the back wheel of the truck. 5 others, all strangers, were there by then. We loaded her whole as there was no place to gut her out right there. That was definitely an impressive pack out for once. Upon doing so, I discovered the first shot had busted 2 ribs just less than 2 inches wide. Hide and flesh was gone in a patch about 2.5 by 9 inches that bared 3 ribs and the space between them. The bullet did not enter the body or puncture the near lung. Tissue under these ribs was not cut or damaged. Several of us inspected it closely as we all hunted with those same loads. 5 or 6 of us were butchers, no sign of the bullet nor particles of it either. At 200 yards, most any bullet should have gone clear through and exited. It did hit direct, straight 90 degrees with no sign of glancing from the angle. 1 single bullet failure out of at least 50 elk killed from the same 500 bulk buy. That's the only modern bullet failure I had. Back in the 50s and 60s, it was common. They'd either splash or punch straight through. We experienced many of both those days. That piqued my interest, so I wrote him back and asked him to describe some of his experiences as a younger man with those older bullets. He replied, I started tagging along in 1956 at age 12. We seldom hunted anything other than elk in that part of Colorado. Ranges were from 40 yards to about 300 max. Those old bullets either worked or they didn't. More penciled through than splashed. In 1961, I got a box of 150 grain Herder's Wasp Waste 30 caliber bullets. I had a wounded 5-point bull elk run past me at 25 feet, shot him in the point of the shoulder. After that, a friend of mine who was with me shot him with a 300 H&H just in front of the withers face on, at maybe 50 to 75 feet. After the elk ran past me, he went down at about 30 yards. We cut the shoulder open to see the damage. There was a 4 to 6 inch diameter wound with some over an inch deep of pulverized meat. That fall deer hunting, I put 3 of those bullets through the back flank on a big muley at a dead run into a very hard headwind. All 3 could be covered with a coffee cup. No indication until the last shot that I hit, then the deer just had a slight flinch. He mentions that he recovered the deer and that he got about 2-inch diameter exit wounds from all 3 of those shots. Not sure what was going on. It sounds like the bullets were upsetting, just like you'd want, but there was maybe delayed expansion, maybe a long neck, so to speak, with those bullets, or maybe they worked great and it was just a really tough deer. Going back into his response here, he says, next day, walking through heavy timber, he shot a huge 3-point that stopped right in front of me with only his butt up and the near short ribs showing. The bullet hit the second or third short rib, exited out the left shoulder, blowing enough away that you could bury a basketball flush in it. All of these were Herder's Wasp Waste 150 grain bullets. I used the rest on prairie dogs. I doubt that buck was over 10 feet from my muzzle. I have never seen as much damage on big game as that buck. End of quote. So it sounds like he got some widely varying terminal performance out of those bullets. Shooting those 2 deer and that elk all at close range. He had one of them that had an absolutely massive exit wound in that front shoulder, the one that he said you could put a basketball in the exit wound. Then he had the other deer that gave no indication at all that it was hit, even after getting hit 3 times, and each of those bullets produced about a 2-inch diameter exit wound. Maybe, like I said, they were working as intended, and maybe it was just a really tough deer, or maybe the bullets were not doing much at all until they upset right before leaving the deer and just leaving a massive exit wound like that. And then, of course, he had that elk where it sounded like that wasp waste bullet splashed on the shoulder and created just a massive but very shallow flesh wound on it. Now, another guy actually emailed me talking about the same bullet type, said that in 1968, my dad shot a buck with a Herder 75 grain and .243 caliber. The bullet totally disintegrated on the shoulder, did not penetrate the vitals. He said this was actually the first deer that he ever field dressed under his dad's guidance, so he always remembered what a mess it was. That is an obsolete bullet that's not available anymore. I'd actually never heard of the Herder's wasp waste projectile prior to receiving these emails. Seems to be a reason why they're not around anymore, though. I found an article written by Rick Jameson, of all people, on these wasp-wasted bullets in Practical Handloader magazine. This is the same Rick Jameson of the WSM and WSSM royalty fight with Winchester fame. He tested some .270 caliber bullets, and if I recall correctly, he said they were very erratic in terms of accuracy. Some rifles loved them, but they shot like garbage in others. I would not be surprised to hear if their terminal performance was similarly erratic. Anyway, Herders went bankrupt in the 1980s. Cabela's owns the brand name now and has other manufacturers, usually Winchester, but sometimes other companies, make ammo under that brand name right now. So Herders ammo that you buy at Cabela's right now is not the same as what you could have gotten 40, 50 plus years ago. All right, moving on. Another guy says, I got my first rifle as an 18th birthday present. It was a Browning A-Bolt in .30-06. Dealer gave me a box of ammo as a nice gesture. Canadian Imperial 220 grain soft point bullets. He claimed these would work on all game, including moose. My first game with these bullets was a small roe deer. Distance was 70 meters. Perfect broadside shot. I aimed on the shoulder, pulled the trigger. The roe deer disappeared in the blast. When I arrived, the deer was still alive, so I had to kill it with my knife. In the shoulder, there was a hole the size of a fist without having gone through the bone. As you know, roe deer are not big or tough animals, and before the shot, I was more worried the bullet would not expand. There were no branches or blades of grass in the path of the bullet, so my only explanation is that the bullet exploded instead of expanding. I never hunted with these bullets again, switched to Nosler partition, shot my first bull moose with the partitions a month later with perfect result. Best regards, Adam from Sweden. Once again, not exactly sure what happened here, but Canadian Imperial is also not around anymore. I heard they were very popular in Canada in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, but are gone now. That might have been a one-off instance of some bad ammo, or just bizarre results. Certainly not what you would expect from shooting a tiny roe deer, which may weigh 75 pounds or 35 kilograms on the hoof at the upper end, with a 220 grain bullet from a .30-06. Now, interestingly, Joseph von Benedict described a similar story. It did have a happier ending, though, where he talked about shooting a bush buck in Africa with a 220 grain round nose bullet from a 300 H&H. Bush buck are a little bit bigger than roe deer, but they're still not very big. He said this one was probably about 90 pounds on the hoof. Said he shot it right behind the shoulder at about 90 yards. The bush buck went down, stone dead. When they were examining it later, they saw that the bullet hit one of the ribs, completely disintegrated, and only penetrated about 7 to 8 inches. In this case, that was more than enough to kill the animal cleanly, but on a different animal, different shot placement angle, something like that, that could have presented some problems. Certainly not what you would expect from a really heavy for caliber 220 grain bullet like that. Joseph's bullet was probably also going a couple hundred feet per second faster out of a 300 H&H versus this guy's .30-06. Joseph was probably also not using Canadian Imperial ammunition on that bush buck, but in each case they were using a 220 grain 30 caliber round nose, very soft cup and core bullet, and they obtained these unexpected and disappointing results. Next, I have two stories from a different guy. So the first one, he said that he shot about a 90-pound doe that was quartering away from him with a 150-grain Norma soft point from the 280 Remington. He said that that bullet hit a rib, disintegrated, made a massive wound that was very shallow, though. Said the range was 50 to 75 yards. And fragments of this bullet peppered the near side lung. He said that was enough to eventually kill the deer, though his tracking job was longer than he wanted. So this was not a very big animal. Once again, like I said, 90-pound doe, white-tailed doe down here in the southern part of the United States. Not the sort of performance you like to see. Now, the same guy shared another story, also a deer in the southern United States. He said this one was a small buck shot at about 90 yards with a .243. He said this took place a long time ago, and he was using a 100-grain Hornady soft point bullet, and he's not certain if that was one of their old Spire Point bullets or an early version of the Interlock. In any case, he shot this deer twice with an old Browning automatic rifle. He said one shot smashed the right front shoulder of this buck, quartering to him. He said the second shot broke the left leg above the hoof. He shot this second shot, and it wasn't a very good one as the deer was escaping. But he said that the fact that he broke that deer's other leg as it was escaping made it easier to track down and finally recover that deer. He said that the first shot came completely apart on the right front shoulder. Some tiny fragments of the bullet made it into that deer's chest, but he said that bullet did indeed disintegrate, and the vast majority of that bullet remained outside of the deer's chest cavity. Anyway, those are all examples of older bullets not performing the way we ideally think they should perform, right? The old ballistic silver tips, the Herder's wasp waist bullet, that old Norma bullet that guy shot with the 280 Remington. He said that bullet has been discontinued now. The same thing with the old Hornady Spire Point or the old Interlock, the Canadian Imperial bullet, all that stuff. There will always be instances of things not working as intended, but that seems to be more common with older bullets than with newer stuff, right? The same thing was true with John Nosler's old story about shooting the moose a bunch of times at close range with the 300 H&H. I don't know what exact bullet he used on that hunt, but that happened in the 1940s, probably using a very old, very soft cup and core bullet. That said, that does not mean the newer bullet designs are perfect either. So we'll talk about some of those. We'll start with some problems with Berger bullets listeners submitted to me. So here's the first one. The following happened to me using 168-grain Berger hybrid hunter bullets out of my .308. I shot a fallow buck at approximately 215 yards. The bullet dropped on the spot, then promptly got up, and thankfully ran towards me. 4 follow-up shots later, at distances ranging from 200 yards to 30 yards, and the deer was down with a final shot through the eye, putting the poor thing out of its misery. When processing the deer, I discovered my initial shot was high, just over lungs and under the spine. The second shot, on a now moving deer, went through both lungs, with a third raking the flank and then burying in one of the back hams. Fourth shot hit the neck, and then the final shot through the eye. Not a single bullet expanded. The one advantage was, despite 5 .308 caliber rounds passing through the carcass, there was shockingly little meat damage. I was very disappointed in the bullet performance, and I consider this a total failure. I have left the Bergers at home and have since used other ammo with much better results. Kind regards, Ben. Here's another story from a different guy. For my personal experience, I had 8 175-grain Berger VLDs from a .308 pencil through a deer at 100 meters. The buck only died when I decided to head shoot it with the 9th bullet. While processing the buck, all we ever saw was very small diameter wound channels through the lungs and both sides of the hide. A year later, I decided to give that box of bullets one more try. I shot a buck at over 500 meters, and it dropped instantly. By the time I got over to it, it was stone dead. Even though it worked perfectly in that instance, I have never shot a Berger bullet again at game. Regards, Ryan. Here's another story from a different listener. This guy shot an antelope in excess of 900 yards with a 7 SAUM using 168 grain Berger VLDs. The shot killed the animal, but the wound was not as impressive as he expected. He calculated 1845 feet per second impact velocity. Now, Berger recommends at least 1800 feet per second for minimum impact velocity, so he was above that threshold, but not by much. I'm guessing that the bullet was just going too slow in this particular guy's case. But there are those other stories I just related of even higher velocity impacts from Bergers not doing too much either. Now, another friend of mine actually had a similar problem with a low velocity impact using 195 grain Berger Elite Hunter bullets from a 7mm PRC. This occurred actually this fall on an elk hunt in Colorado. He shot a small bull elk that was broadside to him for the initial shot. That first shot hit the bull a little high and too far back, but that shot clipped the bull's spine. The bull lost use of his rear legs, but was still standing on his front 2 legs. As he was struggling, he turned towards my friend. My friend shot him again in the chest. That second shot was almost but not completely straight on. This shot hit the heart and lungs, killed the bull. He recovered the second bullet in the skin on the offside of the bull's chest. That bullet exhibited almost no expansion. The front of the jacket was peeled back a tiny bit, and a little bit of it broke off in the offside hide, but that was about it. We did the math later, and we got an impact velocity of just under 1,900 feet per second for my friend. And now, it's possible that this was a similar deal with the guy I just talked about with the 7 SAUM, with the bullet just not going fast enough to really expand. Now, I personally have never killed or even shot at anything with a Berger bullet before. I have shot them plenty at the range, and they've been very accurate in my rifles, though. I recently did a test of that 195 grain Berger from the 7 PRC in gel at a lower velocity, and I also obtained disappointing results. Impact velocity in this case was around 2,300 feet per second. So not super fast, but it was still faster than what my friend got with that exact bullet on his elk. This bullet had a very long neck, like an 8 to 9 inch long neck in the gel. And it actually went almost completely through the entire first gel block before you really had a substantial wound cavity develop. And in this case, it was from the bullet starting to tumble. At least that's what it looked like. There is a link to that test on YouTube in the show notes if you want to check it out. Now, Joseph Von Benedict did an interview with Aaron Davidson from Gunworks a couple years ago on his podcast. And Aaron has used a bunch of different bullets on a lot of different game under a lot of different conditions over the years. And he was talking about Berger type bullets at one point in this interview. He said essentially that when they work great, they're awesome, but when they would occasionally, quote unquote, fail, they would do so in a manner where they would either pencil through the animal completely or travel an excessive distance before upsetting. He talked about aiming for the shoulder blade on animals when using those type bullets to alleviate those problems. All things considered, it seems to be either feast or famine with the Bergers. They will either upset violently in the body and make a mess out of the vitals, or they won't upset at all like these guys experience on animals and like I saw in the gel. Moving on from Berger bullets, they are not the only ones that won't expand or upset from time to time. Here is a message from a different hunter. I have had Hornady 165 grain SST bullets fail to expand. I loaded them for my 30-06 because I heard they were great bullets. I shot 2 does with them, with the first shots being about 15 yards. The first deer ran about 20 yards after getting hit. I thought it was going to tip over, so I shot a second doe out of the same group. I ended up shooting one 3 times, the other one twice. I never found the one I shot 3 times, but the one I shot twice died about 100 yards off. One bullet zipped between the ribs, making a knitting needle hole in both lungs. The other hit a rib and drug bone into the near side lung, but still only made a pencil hole in the other lung. All of the other bullets I tested from that batch of bullets did not expand for some reason. End of quote. Sometimes you just get a bad batch of ammo that slips through quality control. Perhaps that is what happened here. Those are unusual results from the SST, especially with close-range shots from a 30-06 like that. When I have heard problems with those bullets, it seems to be the opposite of what this guy encountered. Here is an example. Hi, John. In August 2022, I hunted on a farm in the northwest province of South Africa using my 270 loaded with 150 grain SSTs, 2770 muzzle velocity. On this specific hunt, this combination took 16 animals: warthog, blesbok, black wildebeest, red hartebeest, and zebra, all one-shot kills. The very last blesbok was taken at a distance of 209 meters ranged, which was the average shooting distance during this hunt. My rifle carries a suppressor, and therefore I could see the bullet hitting behind the shoulder. The animal spun around and streaked off, typical of behavior expected after a heart shot. The animal ran for around 300 meters and then went down head over heels. On reaching the animal, I found a large, shallow wound behind the shoulder, about 3 inches by 2 inches big. Only one lung was damaged, and it looked like it was caused by a shotgun. A few small pieces of the copper jacket were found in the lung. No other parts of the bullet were ever found. On all of the other animals I hunted, the SST performed as expected. Chris. Now that is very interesting performance. I'm not certain what happened here. I calculated about a 2,400 foot per second impact velocity for that bullet with that muzzle velocity at 210 meters like that. Now, according to the data Hornady publishes, 2,400 feet per second impact velocity, that's right in the perfect performance window of that bullet. I would not say this guy was dealing with excessive velocity here, and that's unusual and unexpected performance. Here's another example from a different guy. Hi, John. I live in Newfoundland. Drew my first moose tag 2016. After a few weeks of hunting without a shot opportunity, things were starting to look up one Saturday morning. That morning, there had been a total of 4 moose within several hundred yards of our location. My first shot opportunity came when bull moose number 4 came into my field of view. He was walking at a very slow pace. I ranged him at 265 yards and got into position behind my rifle. I tracked him through the scope, fired a shot once he broke through the alder cover into a small opening. He was slightly quartering towards me, such that the shot opportunity was through the front left shoulder. When the shot rang out, I watched as the moose fell to the ground. I was ecstatic. My first moose, first shot on a moose, down in one shot, or so I thought. When the moose hit the ground, I kept looking through my scope, and to my amazement, about 30 seconds later, I saw a moose running near where I shot my moose. Perplexed, I kept an eye on it, and lo and behold, it was the same bull. With the thick alder cover, it was hard to confirm initially, but once he broke cover, I could see his antlers again. I knew it was the same moose. He was now moving with a purpose. Due to the thick alder cover, there was no opportunity for a follow-up shot. I kept tracking him and saw a clearing that he could be heading towards. Once into the clearing, he stopped. I waited a few seconds to get a shot opportunity. Fortunately, the second shot was broadside. The moose took off running. I did not see him expire. We waited a few minutes, set out to find the moose. After finding the bull, he was still alive. He was lying down on his side. Presumably he fell over as it was clear it was not a natural position. The second shot was more effective than the first. I walked up directly behind him, fired a third and final shot into the base of his skull from behind. I was using a Model 70 chambered in .308 Winchester. Ammunition was Hornady Superformance loaded with 165 grain SST bullet. Range was about 265 yards for the first 2 shots. Impact velocity should have been in the 2,200 to 2,300 foot per second range. The first shot hit the scapula. There was some bloodshot meat around the wound that we cut back to expose the scapula. We found the hole in the scapula, but there was no penetration beyond it. Note that between my family and I, we have killed 3 other moose using that rifle, but have switched to federal ammunition loaded with 180 grain Nosler partition bullets. Only 4 rounds were fired for the next 3 moose, and we have had much better success with that ammo. Regards, Kevin. Kevin and I exchanged some additional emails after that first one. He confirmed to me later that his initial shot definitely did not enter the body cavity of that moose, and he did not recover any large fragments of that bullet either. Very interesting performance. Once again, not exactly sure what happened here, but it certainly sounds like that bullet went to pieces in the shoulder blade and failed to penetrate into the body cavity. Fortunately, he shot it a second time and killed it. Now, a bullet impact velocity of 22 to 2,300 feet per second is once again right in that great performance window for the SST bullet, and we'll talk more about that here in a second. Here is another example with the SST from a different guy. Before I dive into his response, he talks about living in Western Oregon hunting Roosevelt elk. Roosevelt elk live on the Pacific coast of the USA and Canada. They are very large in the body, and they're actually bigger on average than Rocky Mountain elk. And they tend to live in very thick coastal forests in Oregon and Washington in the USA in particular, and shooting distances are often very short in those locations. I have never killed a Roosevelt elk, but I have hunted a lot in their habitat when I lived in Washington. Now, Ivan says that he killed his first bull Roosevelt elk shooting 180 grain Hornady Superformance ammo with the SST bullet out of his 300 Win Mag, Winchester Model 70. Here's what he had to say. As I was walking an old logging road, and I quietly came around a corner with my pack board on and rifle slung on shoulder, no round chambered because it was so slippery and I was being careful. When I rounded that corner, I could see an elk rear end 40 yards away. I shouldered my rifle while chambering around. I swear that bull heard the bolt click and he turned and looked at me. He was a nice, big 5-point bull. I held just behind his shoulder, mid-body. He was slightly quartering away. I was aiming for his offside shoulder. The bullet impacted him. He took off running on 3 legs. I cycled another round, amazingly led him just right, placed the second bullet behind the shoulder, hit double lung. He went maybe 30 yards and piled up. From what I can tell, the first projectile fragmented on contact and or glanced off a rib, drove between the rib cage and his facing shoulder, not entering the chest cavity at all. The second shot was just fine, passed through, but he was fully broadside. Did not recover either bullet. End of quote. Now, Ivan had circumstances very different from the previous couple of guys I talked about with the SST. So this was Ivan's first elk, so not a very experienced hunter. He told me in that same email he chose this ammo because it shot so accurate in his rifle and it gave him a lot of confidence in it. Hornady advertises a muzzle velocity of 3,130 feet per second for the 180 grain 300 Win Mag SST Superformance load. He said he shot this elk at 40 yards. If he was getting close to the advertised muzzle velocity with this ammo, bullet likely had an impact velocity of over 3,000 feet per second at this distance. I recently talked to a rep at Hornady about the ideal impact velocity windows for their ammo. He said that you ideally want an impact velocity of 2,500 feet per second or slower with the SST. Now, the SST is a pretty soft bullet. Now, similar in respect to the ELDX, they're not exactly the same, but they're similar. The old SSTs and the very old Nosler ballistic tips were even softer. In response to customer complaints about poor performance, guys at Nosler and Hornady have tweaked the bullet design of the SST and ballistic tip to make them a little tougher. They're still soft, not quite as soft as they used to be. Now, the first 2 incidents I mentioned with the SST, with the Blessbach and the Moose, were all at impact velocities the bullet should perform well at, and they all occurred recently enough that those guys were likely using the redesigned SST. Those results are concerning and perplexing. This last guy, Ivan, shot that elk with a very soft SST bullet at very close range, and his impact velocity was well in excess of what that bullet is designed for. Now, his hunt also took place recently enough that he was probably using the new SST, but that's still a really soft bullet, and his results make sense to me. That's a clear example of what too fast of an impact velocity can do to a bullet like the SST. So I definitely don't recommend doing that. If you're hunting in thicker country, like Ivan was for really big game, like Roosevelt elk, you want something much tougher, like a Barnes bullet or a partition. Now, speaking of a ballistic tip bullet, here is another example involving that bullet. This guy says, I was a newish hunter at 18 years of age, and I went for a solo moose hunt in 1989. While going to a spot to call moose, I saw one deep in an aspen stand. I called, and he came running. I was super excited when he stopped broadside at 15 yards. I had a 270 shooting the yellow 150 grain Nosler ballistic tips. My first shot went right behind the shoulder in the meat. I found out later it broke a rib but did not touch the lung. As the moose started to move away, I shot a second quartering away shot that broke a rib but penetrated and destroyed one lung. The moose ran away with no third shot option presented. I heard it crash, and he was down about 100 yards away. While gutting the moose, I saw the first shot did no damage to the lung. The second one penetrated about the same distance, but took out the back half of one lung, and that was enough to kill him. I remember looking for the bullets as I was new to reloading, but also could not find anything more than flecks of copper. I think a softball would have fit in the wound channel. Total penetration was about 6 to 8 inches max for both bullets. If you're thinking this was a really big, tough bull moose, you would be wrong. His antlers were small enough not to have paddles and were only visible if he moved his ear. The meat was delicious. I have never hunted with this bullet again, but do use many other Nosler bullets. End of quote. Now, like he said in that message, he said this hunt took place in about 1989. Nosler released the ballistic tip in 1984. Like I just mentioned, early iterations of this bullet were super soft. Nosler marketed that bullet for game like deer, antelope, and sheep. Their idea was the partition was perfect for really big stuff like elk and moose, so they wanted a softer, more aerodynamic bullet with a really cool ballistic tip. Remember, this is the 1980s. That was a really new and innovative design that was great for use on lighter game. Well, it turned out their initial ballistic tip was a little too soft for many people's tastes, especially when some people use them on bigger game, like moose. I have heard current production ballistic tips are quite a bit tougher. They're not as tough as an AccuBond or a partition, but they are tougher than the old ballistic tips in response to complaints like this. This probably explains what happened to this guy. He was a brand new, very inexperienced hunter at the time, and he received an up-close demonstration of how those old, really soft ballistic tips performed at a close-range, high-velocity impact for you. The newer ballistic tips probably would have worked better for him under those exact conditions, but something like a Nosler partition would have been ideal, and it sounds like that's what he has switched over to since this hunt. All right, here's another ballistic tip story for you. I shot a small whitetail with a 325 WSM with a 180 grain ballistic tip. Shot was about 30 yards with a muzzle velocity of 3,030 feet per second. The bullet impacted slightly behind the shoulder and never came close to exiting. You could easily fit a softball inside the entry wound. The jacket was the only piece of the bullet recovered, and it was facing backwards of its entry direction just below the entry side hide. The deer was stone dead on impact, so it died a quick death, but I felt terrible for overkilling this smaller than expected doe and losing so much meat by not making a smart bullet choice. End of quote. That's not so much a bullet failure, but I also wouldn't really consider that ideal performance either. He made a mess out of that deer, though he did kill it instantly. This is close to what some people sometimes describe as an explosion of a bullet. Not literally an exploding bullet, of course, but close. And it's also another example of what potentially can happen when you shoot a bullet that's really soft like that at a very high velocity and hit an animal at close range. It certainly killed it, but delivered unexpected performance he didn't really want. And remember, that's on a not very big whitetail doe. Translate those exact same results onto a bigger animal like an elk in particular, something that's also bigger and known for being pretty darn tough, and he could have had a pretty frustrating hunt. Here's another example with a different bullet. I hunt in Minnesota for whitetail, where most shots are 70 yards and closer. I normally hunt with a Ruger American Ranch in 7.62 by 39. That's not the hottest or most powerful cartridge in the world. The only time I ever shot a deer and felt like the bullet failed was on a broadside buck at 40 yards. It was COVID. I was not able to find the Hornady Black 123 grain SSTs I normally use, so I shot Winchester 123 grain Super X soft points. I was on the ground. The shot was level. I hit the deer right behind the shoulder. It went about 400 yards and died. Very little tracking blood was found. I examined the deer when field dressing it. The bullet hit a rib and exploded into very small fragments. The fragments peppered the onside lung, and the rest of the organs were undisturbed. I never found any large pieces of the bullet. I believe the bullet failed, but even its failure resulted in a dead deer, but I do count myself lucky. End of quote. Yeah, so the 7.62x39 is not a very high velocity cartridge. Advertised velocity for that ammo is around 2,400 feet per second. I'm not sure how fast exactly it was going out of his rifle. That has a short barrel on it. But we're talking, no matter how you slice it, about a pretty low to moderate impact velocity on this deer. Yet the bullet still just went to pieces like that. And it sounds like he was very fortunate he recovered that deer. Now, the Super X is a very soft bullet. I don't know if this was a one-off incident or something that is indicative of more issues with this bullet that people need to be cautious with. Now let's talk about a couple of other instances of unexpected bullet performance on the opposite end of the spectrum. All right, this next guy says, I was shooting a .416 Rigby with 400 grain factory-loaded Barnes TSX bullets. This failure happened on a Cape Buffalo hunt in South Africa in 2021. My first shot was from about 90 yards. It was a good double lung shot that eventually brought the buffalo down. But after my first shot, the buffalo took off running. I shot 2 or 3 more times as the buffalo ran away. He ran about another 100 yards after being hit before going down. The skinners recovered all of my bullets, 2 of which hit and were just barely below the skin. When the bullets were recovered, only the tip was slightly expanded, and it did not even expand to the diameter of the bullet's base. I have never seen anything like it before, but in this case, 2 out of 3 of the bullets that hit the buffalo failed, both in the same way, and with the same result of bad penetration and little to no expansion. I'm sure glad it was running away from me and not charging. When I shot, I did not notice a significant difference in report or recoil from the 3 different shots. Neither did my PH. Other than that, I have always had excellent results with Barnes bullets. All right, here's a story from another guy. During my first Cape Buffalo hunt in Zimbabwe, we were on the trail of a nice kudu. I was carrying a Dakota M97 in 7mm Dakota, shooting 160 grain Swift A-frame bullets. That was a very accurate combination. A kudu stepped out of the bush, slightly quartering towards us around the 150 to 175 yard mark. I took the shot, heard the impact, quickly cycled the bolt, but the kudu had disappeared into the bush. We found him not too far from where I hit him. That evening before dinner, the PH handed me the bullet the skinners had recovered. The bullet was deformed and bent, but did not expand at all. The only explanation I can think of is it must have hit the shoulder or joint area just right to cause the deformation. The area in front of the kudu was clear, so I don't think it hit a small tree or anything. Whatever happened ended up being a fatal one-shot kill. The bullet must have tumbled in the kudu. All right, here's another story from a different guy, and this is actually the same guy that had the story of the 2 deer he shot in the southern USA where the bullets failed to penetrate. Well, he shot a different deer with a .35 Whelen with a 225 grain Nosler partition. He said this was a medium-sized 160, 170-pound buck. Buck was quartering away, hit it behind the shoulder. The bullet exited in front of the opposite shoulder. He said there was very modest entrance and exit wounds, not much damage to the vitals. Muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, thereabouts. At 75 yards, that works out to about 2,450 feet per second of impact velocity. Should have been right in that sweet spot for great expansion in terms of impact velocity, but it didn't sound like it worked out that way. Once again, we don't know for sure what happened since the bullet was not recovered, but he did recover the animal, and he said that the bullet certainly damaged the vitals of the animals and killed the deer, but it was just not nearly as impressive of a wound as he was expecting. Here's a different example from a different guy. He sent me a picture of a 200 grain terminal ascent bullet he used in his 300 Win Mag on a hunt in South Africa. He said he shot a kudu that was quartering away from him at pretty close range with that bullet. He said it put the animal down. He shot it again as a finishing shot, and that other bullet exited, but he recovered the first shot. And this bullet looks like you took a pair of pliers and just bent the nose over on it. So it looked like it was bent and deformed and probably tumbled inside the kudu, but did not expand or upset in a more traditional manner like that. He did say he was shooting in thick bush and speculated it's possible that maybe the bullet hit a branch or something like that between him and the kudu and tumbled and maybe hit the kudu not straight on like that. Maybe it had already started to tumble before it hit it. So even though the story had a happy ending, that's certainly unusual performance for a bullet. But like I said, and like he thinks too, it's certainly possible that the bullet impacted something on the way to the animal. Now, another listener submitted a story to me about an ibex he shot in Spain several years ago with a .338 Win Mag. The ibex was a little over 400 yards away. Shot it with a 225 grain GMX bullet. Hornady no longer makes that bullet. They have since replaced it with their CX projectile, but they're both very similar. They are very tough, lead-free projectiles, sort of along the lines of, say, a Barnes TTSX bullet. Well, he shoots this ibex at a little over 400 yards, hits it behind the shoulder. The bullet hits both lungs, exits out the offside, and the ibex just stands there for a second, doesn't even act like he's been hit, then starts moving away. This guy chambers another round, hits it again in the neck this time, puts it down. They recover the ibex, check it out, see that that initial shot did very little damage to the vitals of the animal. Caliber-sized entrance wound, hit between two ribs, made a more or less bullet diameter hole through both lungs, and then made a slightly larger than caliber-sized exit wound on the offside shoulder. So what the heck happened here? I think that bullet was going too slow to get proper expansion at that distance. Tougher bullets, especially stuff like the CX and the GMX from Hornady, need a faster impact velocity to get good expansion. Hornady advertises 2,000 feet per second as their minimum recommended impact velocity for that bullet. And that may be true, right? If you hit something going that fast with it, it'll do at least something. But to get a really substantial, impressive wound cavity, you need a bullet that's going even faster than that. These bullets have a very high maximum impact velocity threshold, right? You shoot something at 3,000 feet per second with one of these really tough lead-free bullets, it's going to hold together really well, probably, and still penetrate really well, and also make a devastating wound cavity. But as the bullet impact velocity gets slower, that wound cavity is going to shrink in diameter. And if that bullet does not hit any bones going through the animal, you can get some very small wounds going through it at those lower impact velocities, say around 2,000 feet per second. Well, that's probably what was going on here. I don't know exactly how fast this ammo was going out of his rifle, but I would not be surprised to hear that he was actually obtaining an impact velocity around, say, 2,050, maybe 2,100 feet per second that day under those conditions. Now, you shoot that same ibex at 200 or 300 yards instead of a little over 400, and then the story is very different. Here's another story of sometimes just how weird things happen on game afield. This other guy was deer hunting in Mississippi. He had a Ruger American in .30-06 shooting 150 grain Remington core locks. A buck came out right before the end of legal shooting light. He shot at it. The buck just stood there and looked at him. He shot again, and the buck turned and ran away. And he surmised later that he thinks he probably missed with that first shot and then hit with the second shot, because as you'll see here in a second, he hit it exactly one time. He had a heck of a time finding that deer. He looked and looked and looked. found just a tiny bit of blood, went out, got a friend that had a tracking dog, which was legal in that area. They went in with the tracking dog and eventually found that deer that evening. He said that it was probably about 150 yards away from where he initially shot it, piled up in some real thick cover. He says, when I examined the entrance and exit wounds, I could tell something was a little off. The bullet impacted low and forward on the front shoulder and appeared to have turned 90 degrees and exited down through the sternum. Penetration was just adequate enough for the bullet to hit the heart on its way out. I'm still not exactly sure why the bullet did what it did. My best guess is the bullet hit one of the bones or joints near the shoulder of the deer and it deflected downwards. Now, he says earlier in his message that the initial shot was about 125 to 150 yards away, and the deer was very close to broadside when he shot. So that was very unusual performance. But it certainly sounds like, from what he's describing, the bullet penetrated in and then angled downwards and out like that. Fortunately, it did catch a little bit of the vitals on the way out to kill the deer, and they had that dog to help him find it. That is unusual but not unheard of performance. All right, now let's talk a little bit about feral hogs. I've talked about buffalo, I've talked about deer, elk, moose to this point, but feral hogs are kind of their own thing. And I've hunted a lot of hogs in Texas where I live, and a lot of other people that I correspond with that live in the southern USA get to hunt them a lot as well. Some people in New Zealand and whatnot as well. But in any case, hogs really are their own kind of unique thing. They are, on average, closer in size to deer, though they can get quite a bit bigger than your average deer. But they have kind of a unique body construction. Their hide is much thicker than the hide of a normal deer. Bigger hogs, especially bigger boars, do have that cartilage shield over their side. It's not bulletproof by any means, but all in all, a feral hog is a tougher cookie than a deer of a similar size. Hogs also really run the gamut in size too. A lot of people take 50, 60, 70, 80-pound hogs. They're really common, but they can also get really big. It's not unheard of for hunters to kill legitimate 200-plus pound hogs, and even 300 and even 400-pound plus hogs definitely exist as well. And those bigger hogs can really put a bullet to the test. Here's an example. Same guy we've heard from a couple of times already. This guy hunts a lot, and he likes to use a lot of different bullets and cartridges on game just to see how it will perform. In this particular case, he shot a really big sow that he said that they weighed afterwards and was a legitimate 250 pounds. That's a big hog just in general, and it is a massive sow. He says they were hunting this hog using hounds, and he was using an 85-grain Sierra Game King in a 243 because he was looking for something that he thought would cleanly kill a hog, but was not likely to exit a hog to minimize the chances of accidentally hitting a dog or something like that on one of these hunts, and they can get a little chaotic sometimes. He said that the dogs had bayed up this hog. He got in there, shot it at very close range with this rifle, straight on the center of the shoulder, and clearly hit the hog, but the hog did not act as though she was injured. So he chambered a different bullet, this time a Winchester failsafe, shot it again, and he said that that hog just dropped like that, just like she'd been struck by lightning. He said the Winchester failsafe went all the way through the hog. The Game King did not penetrate through the shoulder of the hog. And like I said, this hog was an honest 250 pounds on the scale later, and when they were butchering her, it is unusual for a sow to have a big cartilage shield, but he said that this one did. He said it was just a really big, thick, hided hog like that. Now, like I said, this particular guy has killed a lot of game over the years. He owns some land close to where he lives in Mississippi and will often run hog traps out there. And he says that when he catches hogs in these traps, he'll go and shoot them with different cartridges and bullets to see what sort of terminal performance he'll get. And he says he does this dozens of times a year. He said in one case, he shot two 200-plus pound boars, both with a 6.5 PRC at very close range, like 5 yards with them in the trap like that. He said one hog he shot with a 147 grain ELD match bullet. The other he shot with the 143 grain ELDX bullet. He said both hogs died almost instantly from those shots. He said the ELDX completely passed through the hog. He said the match bullet did not, but it penetrated, just wrecked the vitals inside the body cavity, but went completely to pieces. And he said he found just a bunch of tiny fragments of it embedded in the offside rib cage of that hog. Not really a bullet failure in either case, but certainly interesting performance. And remember, that was from a 6.5 PRC. So those bullets were going really fast. Here's another story from a different hunter. This guy said he was using an AR-10 style rifle chambered in .45 Raptor, shooting 240 grain Hornady XTP bullets. He shot a hog at about 30 yards that was strongly quartering towards him. He said he hit it straight in that near side shoulder. The pig spun around at the shot, ran away. He said he could tell one leg wasn't moving well, and he assumed that he made a good shot. He followed the blood trail for this hog, and he says that there were not many blood drops, but he says there was enough there that he could follow where it went. He said he finally caught up to this hog after about 175 yards, and it was standing still about 75 yards from him. He said he fired again. This was a pretty close to broadside shot, and the pig dropped in its tracks. While cleaning the animal, he says he found the first bullet lodged in the near side shoulder. So this was a 240 grain bullet. He said it weighed 115 grains, and he said it was nearly flattened out completely, and the petals of the bullet were peeled almost completely around the base of the bullet. He said the second round passed cleanly through the animal. Now, the .45 Raptor is a proprietary cartridge that's basically a .308 Winchester necked up to .45 caliber. It uses .452 caliber pistol bullets, same as the .45 ACP, .45 Colt, and .460 Smith & Wesson. It's a big bore cartridge for AR-10 frame rifles. It is flatter shooting and more powerful than the .450 Bushmaster, .50 Beowulf, and .458 SOCOM. Underwood advertises a muzzle velocity of 2,500 feet per second for the 240 grain FTX in their .45 Raptor ammo. When I talked to the rep at Hornady about this, he said that 23 to 2,400 feet per second is the maximum recommended impact velocity for the FTX bullet. So yes, this actually looks like another instance where the bullet was going too fast and really did pancake. It did not explode though, and it only pancaked on that strongly quartering to shot angle at really close range, 30 yards. So this happened under very specific conditions. Strongly quartering to angle at very close range with a pretty big, tough, thick-hided animal in this really good-sized feral hog. This guy sent me pictures of the hog. It's a really nice-looking hog, really mean, nasty-looking, just like you like to see a feral hog. And like I said, he did recover the bullet and sent me a picture of the bullet. And it looks like you put that bullet in a press and just smashed it pretty close to flat. Now, his second shot, same bullet, same ammo, was at the same hog farther away, so 75 yards in this case instead of 30, so it was going a little slower, and the shot angle was different. It was broadside instead of strongly quartering, and so that penetrated, wrecked the vitals of the animal, exited the offside. All that makes sense and is about what I would have expected under those circumstances. Now here is another story along those lines. This one does not involve a feral hog, though. This guy was on a guided elk hunt. Somebody shot and crippled an elk, but it was still alive. One of the guides that was there had a .22-250, walked up to the elk, shot it in the chest with a 40 grain varmint bullet. At about 5 feet, he said the bullet created a really wide but very shallow superficial wound, and it did not kill the bull. They had to shoot it again behind the ear to finish it off. He said that when they skinned that elk out, they verified that varmint bullet did not enter the chest cavity, and he said the pleura was unscratched. Now, once again, this isn't really surprising to me. This was another extreme case of a lightly constructed bullet at very high velocity at nearly point blank range. That's the perfect scenario for the bullet to grenade upon impact rather than penetrate. So those are all examples of what can potentially happen when you use a bullet for a situation outside of its ideal use case. People can and do kill big game with varmint bullets. Sometimes they work fine, but sometimes you get performance like this. It sounds like that bullet actually performed as designed, making a very wide but very shallow wound. And that would not have been immediately fatal to that elk. Now let's talk a little bit more about the ELDX bullet, the bullet some people love to hate. First, we'll start with a story John Stallone and I talked about in his podcast this summer. He was guiding a client on a Coues deer hunt in Arizona last year. This guy had a 6.5 Creedmoor rifle shooting the Hornady Precision Hunter ammo. He said that this guy was disabled and was hunting on a disabled permit, so it was hard for him to get around, but the guy could shoot like nobody's business. Well, they got on a nice Coues deer and took a shot at it at 709 yards. John said the first shot was high, but not excessively high. And he verified later the bullet did hit the lungs of that deer. The deer ran, eventually stopped. The hunter shot again at a quartering angle. And he said the second shot was too far back, hit the guts, exited the offside, broke the rear leg. He said that they moved closer to the deer because it was still alive. He said the third shot was much closer and was straight on, hit it straight in the chest. He said that was a really good shot. Shot it again. Shot number 4 hit the deer in the neck. So that was 4 shots with a 6.5 Creedmoor to kill a Coues deer that weighed, 100 pounds and change. They're not very big animals. It's hard to say exactly what the heck happened here in this instance. But they did kill the animal, they did recover it, and they were able to examine it and trace the bullet paths through this deer, which was just all shot to pieces at this point. Now, if we assume that this ammo was doing about 2,700 feet per second at the muzzle, which is what Hornady advertises that ammo at that range, it was doing something like 1,750, 1,800 feet per second. That is a slow impact velocity, but it is above the 1,600 feet per second minimum impact velocity Hornady states for that bullet. The Hornady rep I talked to says that bullet should get about 1.5x expansion at 1,600 feet per second. But it's possible, say, that ammo was going a little bit slower at the muzzle. Maybe it was only going 2,600 feet per second instead of 2,700. Well, if that's the case, then the bullet was going even slower when it impacted. All in all, I think that bullet probably expanded a little bit, but not very much when it impacted. It's also possible, especially for that first shot where the deer was close to broadside, that bullet slipped in between the ribs, entered the body cavity without much resistance to help initiate expansion. Now, some people might call this a bullet failure. It actually sounds like those bullets were performing close to designed, even though they were not performing as desired because they were being used right at the edge of appropriate impact velocity. So I think the low impact velocity resulted in subpar expansion. You combine that with marginal, not terrible, but not great shot placement, and a massive adrenaline dump by the deer after that first shot, and you could get a situation like this. Some animals are also just tougher than others, too. This might have been one of those really tough deer that just was not ready to give up. If you take that initial shot on the deer at 500 yards instead of 700 yards, or with a 6.5 PRC instead of a 6.5 Creedmoor, or maybe 1 to 2 inches lower for the first shot, or an inch forward or backwards that hits a rib square on with that initial shot, you might have had different results. But it sounded like it was a crummy, really frustrating situation for John and his client on that hunt. Moving on, here's a message I got from another guy, also shooting a 6.5 Creedmoor, also 143 grain ELDX. He said last year he shot 2 does with 1 shot. And I talked to him later, and he said that second doe was actually behind the first doe, and he didn't know it was there when he shot it. But in any case, so that bullet passed through the lungs of the first, hit a rib, both lungs. The other doe behind her was hit by the bullet just behind the front leg, exited the off shoulder, right at the shoulder joint. Said he saw very large exit wounds on both deer. They each ran approximately 30 yards. Now, this is, once again, not really a failure. It sounds like he cleanly killed 2 deer with 1 shot from the 6.5 Creedmoor. Now, to hear some talk about the cartridge, though, that would be unexpected performance. Not shocking performance to me. He said that these deer were about 75 yards away, so not super close, but not far either. A behind-the-shoulder shot on a doe at a range like that should exit with that bullet. I personally would have guessed that the bullet would have stopped in the second deer, but I'm not flabbergasted that it went completely through her, too. Now, another hunter did email me with very different performance with the 6.5 Creed and the 143 grain ELDX, though. This guy was on a hunt out west, shot an antelope at 225 yards with that bullet. He said he hit it, was close to broadside, hit it in the shoulder, created a very nasty wound. He said did not penetrate through the shoulder, did not enter the body cavity. He said that the antelope went around a bluff, and he actually managed to get on this antelope again, shoot it again, kill it with the second shot. He emailed me a photo of the dead antelope, but he said he did not take a picture of the bullet wound where the ELDX failed to penetrate into the body cavity. Now, I hear from people, not all the time, but frequently, about describing situations like this where they shoot an animal with an ELDX bullet of one kind or another, usually a higher velocity round, like a 7 rim mag or something like that, and they say the bullet will blow up on the shoulder and the animal will run away and they never recover it. It's hard to know what happens in situations like that when the guy doesn't recover the animal. Like I said, I hear these stories all the time, but this is the only person I've ever directly heard from who said, yes, it happened to me. I killed the animal and I was able to verify what happened with that initial shot, where the bullet just did not reach the vitals for whatever reason. Now, similar to the stories I shared about the SST bullets failing to penetrate earlier in this episode, this is not the sort of performance you should be getting with the ELDX bullet at a mild to moderate impact velocity at 200 plus yards like that. Now, the ELDX is similar enough in construction to the SST that these results of excessive expansion and inadequate penetration, it's easy for me to believe them. If they're happening with the SST, they do happen with the ELDX from time to time as well. But it was just interesting to me that I received so many more stories of that happening with the SST and just one about the ELDX. Now, I received another story from a different guy involving the ELDX. He was shooting a 162 grain ELDX from a 7 rim mag. He said he shot this deer at about 500 yards, velocity at impact around 2,250 feet per second. Said he hit the deer behind the shoulder and the bullet grenaded on impact. But the deer did die and he recovered it. He said just went straight down like that. And he sent me a picture of this deer and oh my gosh, this is one of the most horrific wounds I've ever seen. It looks like he shot it several times with birdshot from a shotgun at close range. Just an absolute bloodshot mess. It looks like you could easily fit a softball inside that wound cavity that bullet made on that deer. So in this case, it was very effective at quickly killing that deer. And like you said, just went down, just boom, just like that. But he said he lost almost all the meat on the front half of that deer. Now, the last story I'm about to tell you also involves an ELDX bullet, but it's on the other end of the spectrum in terms of terminal performance. This guy was using a 308 Winchester, shooting 178 grain ELDX bullets. Said he shot a red stag behind the shoulder with this bullet. And he said this stag took off running and went farther than any other deer he's ever shot with an ELDX bullet, but he did recover it. He said that he was very surprised when he recovered that deer, opened up the body cavity. He said that the entrance wound was perfectly round, and it was almost exactly 308 caliber in diameter, and the exit hole was almost exactly the same, maybe a tiny bit wider, and said that it was just very unimpressive damage to the vitals. So this looks like an instance where he shot this deer at a short to moderate range like that. It wasn't very far, but it just did not do much damage to the insides of the deer. Looks like it expanded, just not very much. He said he has shot hundreds of deer with ELDX bullets, and this is the only time he has ever had results like that. Now, when you query thousands of hunters for stories of unexpected bullet performance that occur over the course of, say, 6 or 7 decades of hunting, you will get all kinds of stories that illustrate all kinds of different problems and performance, like I discuss in this episode. Now, sometimes you get a bad batch of ammo, right? It sounds like the one guy with the SST bullets that weren't really expanding had to deal with that. Sometimes you run into problems when you use bullets outside of their intended use, right? The guy that shot the elk with the varmint bullet, the guy that shot my Cape Buffalo with the 7.62x39, the people that shot the XTP and SST bullets at too high of a velocity, the people that shot the ELDX at too low of a velocity. Now, some bullets, especially some of those older models, like some versions of the old metal-capped ballistic silver tips, were just poorly designed. Now, that definitely happens, and though those companies don't necessarily like to publicize all of the gory details, bullet manufacturers redesign their bullets for a reason. If it were perfect to begin with, there would be no reason to redesign it. Nosler and Hornady tweaked their ballistic tip and SST bullets to make them tougher. Same thing with Barnes, tweaking the original X bullet to, among other things, make it more likely to upset. Right? Sometimes those things occur. Now, sometimes an outside influence causes the bullet to perform in an unexpected manner, like the guy with the bent terminal ascent bullet, right? Like I said, it's possible he hit a branch or something that caused the bullet to yaw. And if that happened, that's not really the bullet's fault, but sometimes weird things happen like that. Sometimes weird things just happen with an otherwise good bullet that is used within its intended constraints. There were some interesting trends I noticed in this episode, though. The softer bullets like the SST, ELDX, PowerPoint, and ballistic tip all appear to be more likely to exhibit excessive expansion and poor penetration, especially at higher velocities. But those problems were not limited exclusively to very high velocity impacts in this episode, right? That PowerPoint bullet wasn't going that fast out of that guy's 7.62x39 rifle when he shot the deer. The same thing with the guy that shot the antelope with the ELDX bullet that failed to penetrate. Same thing with the guy in Colorado that shot that cow elk with the Remington Corlock out of his 300 Win Mag. It was going faster than the others, but that was still a 200-ish yard impact. Now, that doesn't always happen, of course. I also talked about that guy that shot 2 does with the same ELDX bullet, for instance, and the bullet exited both of them. We had that other guy that had the ELDX bullet that failed to upset at all, despite adequate impact velocity. Right? The guy that shot the stag, the very last story I told. The same thing was true with the one guy who had the similar experience with those several SST bullets. Now, I didn't talk about it in this episode because I was focused on bullet failures, but there's lots of people that use all of those bullets I just talked about and have had great results with every single one of them. I've killed big game animals with every single bullet type I talked about in this episode except the burgers, and I've never had a problem with any one of them. So that's not to say these bullets are bad or they don't work. But I will say that excessive expansion seems more common with those softer bullets I just listed. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, those tougher bullets seem like they are more likely to not expand much or at all if there was a problem. You throw the Swift A-frame, the terminal ascent, the partition, the Barnes bullets all into this category. Oh, wow, John, that's really amazing, man. Thanks for taking an hour and a half to tell me that soft bullets can expand too much and that tough bullets can expand not enough. In other news, water is wet. No earth-shaking revelations here. It's also important to note that I'm talking about small sample sizes in this episode. I had like 4 problems with burger bullets I described in this episode, 4 with SSTs. Everything else was less than that. I had the same number of reports, 1 of each, of the ELDX failing to penetrate as I did of it not appearing to upset much at all with enough impact velocity. I also had no reports on people having problems with ELD match bullets, Nosler AccuBond, and Nosler Accubon long-range bullets, among other projectiles that failed one way or another. Now, I'm not sure if the lack of data points on those bullets was just due to people not having problems with them, or if it is a sampling bias stemming, for instance, just from a lack of people in my audience who had issues with them or even hunt with those bullets to begin with. Maybe I just don't have a lot of listeners that hunt with an ELD match, for instance, and that could explain why I don't have too many listeners who have had subpar results with that bullet. Email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, if you would like to share a story of a so-called failure with any bullet, but especially one I did not cover in this episode. Maybe I'll do another episode on down the line with more stories like this one. But with all that said, though, don't ever let anyone tell you that bullet failures never happen. Even if you're using a bullet within its recommended design parameters, that is to say, not too fast and not too slow, weird things happen sometimes. Now, we have come a long way with bullet technology in the last 100 years, and we have access to much better stuff overall now than what my grandfather and father had access to when they were young men. Nothing is perfect, nothing is guaranteed, but stuff seems like it works pretty darn well if you use it as designed. But failures clearly happen from time to time. It's very easy to brush off complaints about poor bullet performance. Now, there's something of a trend right now for people to use smaller, more lightly constructed bullets for hunting big game. Proponents of doing so will often dismiss concerns about those bullets failing to penetrate deep enough to reach the vitals of an animal. Those same people will often point out the, sometimes true, issues with so-called tougher bullets not upsetting much on bigger game and creating smaller wound cavities. Now, we are all humans and we all have our biases, and it's only natural to minimize potential problems with stuff you like and magnify problems with stuff you don't like for whatever reason. If you go to some of those people promoting those lighter bullets and say you had one of those bullets they recommend fail to penetrate, and they'll often not take you seriously. They'll probably say you made a bad shot, and that's the actual reason why you didn't recover the animal. And unless you actually did recover the animal, like the people I talked about in this episode, there's no way to know for sure what happened. Maybe you did make a bad shot. That's probably actually the single most likely explanation for wounding and losing game. But, like I said though, don't ever let anyone tell you bullet failures never happen either, because they clearly do. They're not as common as some people make them out to be, but they definitely occur sometimes. There's no way to avoid them all the time. The best we can do as hunters is to balance the pros and cons of the different bullet types and pick the one ideally suited to the situation and to use it within the parameters it is designed to function under. And of course, you must do your absolute best as a hunter to put that bullet exactly where it should go on the animal to cause maximum damage to the vitals of that creature. The details vary a lot here. Different bullets have different ideal impact velocity windows. Use the same bullet out of a different cartridge, right? Like that 143 grain ELDX out of a 6.5 Creedmoor versus a 6.5 PRC, and you can get noticeably different terminal performance. The same is true for different ranges, 100 yards versus 600 yards, for instance, and for different shot placement scenarios on different animals. A broadside whitetail versus an elk or, God forbid, a Cape buffalo strongly quartering towards you. What works well in one scenario might be a terrible choice for a different one. There are scenarios I would happily use the ELDX, SST, ballistic tip, etc. under. Likewise, there are scenarios I would much prefer something like a Barnes, a partition, or an A-frame. But that is a story for a different day and is really outside the scope of this episode. To learn more about all of this, I highly recommend checking out Hunting Guns 101. You will learn lots of useful information about practical ballistics and firearms in general in that training that will help you be more successful afield and fill more tags on your hunts. Among other things, I discuss terminal ballistics in great detail in part of that training, to include multiple examples of bullet performance in animals with different bullet types, different shot angles, and different impact velocities. You will also receive access to my extensive and growing library of ballistic gel tests, along with side-by-side comparisons that show how some of those loads actually performed on game, that will all demonstrate the wide spectrum of results you can expect from different cartridges and bullets that you can use to tailor your hunting load to the specific situation to hopefully minimize the chances of experiencing a bullet failure afield and to maximize the chances of cleanly killing the game you are pursuing. Click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com/form and fill out the order form to sign up and get instant access today. That's huntingguns101.com/form. As we wrap up, do not forget to sign up for my ammo giveaway at the link in the show notes or by going to thebiggamehuntingblog.com/ammo giveaway. And be sure to email me if you will be joining me at the Dallas Safari Club Convention in Atlanta in January. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today,